Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we're going to have a build of a vintage Airfix 1/72 scale ME163 Komet. First up, I give all the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or dirt that's built up over the years, and then I begin to cut out and assemble the cockpit. The cockpit in this kit, rather unsurprisingly, is pretty basic, with a floor, a rear bulkhead with a head cushion, a seat, and a joystick. I decided to cut out some extra pieces of sprue and add a couple of little areas to the sides of the pilot which would have been instrument panels. There's also a main instrument panel with a few raised details, although no decals included. While waiting for the cockpit parts to dry, I also assembled the landing gear skid and the little dolly, which had some nice details on it. I decided to use the ski as a jig to help assembling the dolly, but in the end I wouldn't glue it to the skid so that I could take it off for stop motions or for display. There is a small circle bulkhead that goes on where the exhausts are, and once it's in place I paint 2 coats of Tamiya XF24 dark grey for the interior colours. Once the cockpit is dry, I use some Vallejo 70909 Vermillion Red, 70953 flat yellow and 70951 flat white to add some dots onto the instrument panel to help create a base colour for the instruments. While they dry, I then use 70872 chocolate brown to paint the leather cover on the joystick and for the pilot's head cushion, and then I get out some 950 flat black, and as well as painting the top of the joystick, dab a little circle on the centre of each of the yellow, red and white dials to create some basic instrument details. With the basic interior done, I then glue the 2 fuselage halves together and hold them in place using some Tamiya masking tape. I then sanded the wing roots to make them fit a little bit better to the fuselage halves and then glued them into place. There was a small gap between the wings and the fuselage, but nothing that a bit of putty couldn't fix at a later date. I glued the tail wheel into position at the back of the aircraft and then glued the frames that hold the ski and then the ski itself onto the aircraft. By this stage the fuselage halves were definitely dry, so I removed the masking tape and then decided to run a little bead of Revell Contacta Professional in the gaps between the wings and the fuselage to try and soften the line between them. In the end though, it was still a little bit too much of a gap, so I got out some of my Vallejo water-based putty and using a cocktail stick applied it onto the areas where there were some gaps. One of the advantages of the water-based putty is obviously you can thin it down with a little bit of water, and you can also easily wipe away the excess with your fingers, and unlike some of the other putties out there, you can easily wash them off. Once I'd smoothed down the putty with my fingers, I left the model to dry for about 24 hours, and then used some very fine sandpaper to sand away any excess, and rescored the panel lines using a knife. Next came the painting. The instructions included the old Humbrol colours for the scheme I chose, however it looked to me like RLM 76, 81 and 82, which was pretty typical for late war 163s. For the underside, I used AK Interactive's RLM 76 version number 1. I use a little bit of water to help thin the paint and then apply it onto the model in the same direction to help reduce the brush strokes. After the first coat of RLM 76 is applied, I turn to the upper surface. I decided to experiment and used Vallejo 70924 Russian Uniform Green, which is supposed to be equivalent to RLM 83, but to me it looked a little bit more like the more pale version of RLM 82. Regardless, after the first coat I was quite happy with how it turned out, so I decided to stick with it. For RLM 81 I used chocolate brown once more, and this time I applied the outline for the camouflage pattern and then gradually fill the shape in as much as possible, trying to paint from the front of the aircraft to the rear, once again to help reduce how visible the brush strokes are. The Vallejo colours produced a much more pale and faded appearance than what I'd previously done with, say, the Tamiya colour range, but I was still pretty happy with the result, and I'm sure there would have been a lot of variations of this paint scheme, especially late in the war as standardisation kind of went out the window. I painted a second coat of RLM 76 on the underside, and while waiting for it to dry used a fine brush to paint the interior colour for the canopy frame, which was going to be XF24 dark grey. I also painted a bit of dark grey around the window frames, and then painted a second coat of the Russian Uniform Green. Since I was only going to do one more coat of the RLM 76, I decided to also do the modelling at this stage for both the green and the chocolate brown. To create the modelling, I first thinned down the paint with a lot of water to make it nice and blotchy, and then gently dab it onto the areas where I want to apply the mottling. I then let the mottling dry, and whilst it was drying I painted the second coat of chocolate brown, and then I applied the chocolate brown modelling over the top of the green. Once the modelling had been applied, I gave it a bit of time to dry, and in the meantime painted the canopy frame's exterior colour, which was going to be the Russian uniform green. After around about an hour, the modelling was nice and dry, so I then applied the third and final coat of RLM 76, making sure to keep it nice and thin so that you could still see the modelling through it, giving a bit of an airbrushed and faded appearance. I got a bit ahead of myself and decided to apply the decals when I really should have done a third coat of the uniform green, but the other colours were alright and I did manage to fix this a little bit later, as you'll see. I apply the decals by sticking the sheet of transfer paper in some warm water for about 10 seconds, and once they come loose from the transfer paper, I slide them onto the model using my brush and then make any final adjustments. Once the decals are all on the model, I then apply a bit of Tamiya decal adhesive to help them conform to the model. I didn't want to use decal softener on these decals because they were quite old, and although they did tear in a few places, overall they were really quite fantastic for their age. I then use a cocktail stick to scratch off any mistakes on the canopy, and then I started to glue some of the finer accessories such as the pitot tube and the small propeller for the power generator. I started to paint the finer details using various colours such as flat black for the rubber on the tyres, chocolate brown for the pitot tube, uniform green for the radio antenna, and also flat white and vermilion red for the nose of the aircraft. I had to do about 2 coats for most of these colours, and 3 for the white and the red since they were a lot lighter. I then cut out the clear windows that go behind the pilot, and using a bit of Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue, glued them into place. As I mentioned, I had some trouble with some areas of the uniform green, especially on the leading edge where there were a few mistakes, so I decided to carefully paint a third coat of it, as well as a third coat of chocolate brown, just to do a few touch-ups. I wanted to keep in mind a few things about the 163 when doing the weathering, the first one being the fact that after each of the fuel types were loaded in, the aircraft would have received a thorough wash. This is because obviously the T-stuff and the C-stuff, which were both used as the fuel for the rocket, would cause some pretty nasty explosions and even melt human flesh if they came into contact. So as a result, the aircraft, both inside and out, was flushed very thoroughly with water. This would mean there wouldn't be much built up of dirt even on the areas where the pilot and the crew would walk, or even much grease and stuff inside the control surfaces, so I decided to try and keep it as light as I possibly could on the upper surfaces especially. Next came the chipping, and as for where it was placed, there seems to be a lot of marks in the pictures around the areas where the access hatches are for the fuel. It probably makes sense given that it would have been regularly opened and there would have been a lot of cleaning as well as various equipment bumping into things and causing some scratches. The other thing to consider is the fact that the 163 has a lot of wood. There's a brilliant picture of an aircraft from the Smithsonian before it was restored that shows a lot of the areas that were wood. As you can see, it's basically the main section of the wing and a little bit of the leading edge. Even though I did this thorough research and tried to be conscious, I still managed to completely mistake an entire panel that would have been metal and accidentally gave it wooden chipping. I've kept the part where I do the wooden chipping on this area just to show how I do it, but I also correct it later on. I use a fine brush to apply the XF16 flat aluminium to create the metal chipping onto the areas around the fuel access ports, on the wings, some of the metal control surfaces, and also on the skis. I also use it on the pitot tube. For the wooden chipping, I use Tamiya XF52 flat earth and streak it onto the areas where I want to apply it. I then apply a little bit of Tamiya buff over the top of it to create a slight wooden grain effect. In between chipping, I also paint the wheel hubs of the tyres X1 gloss black, and once the chipping is dry, I apply a bit of chocolate brown to help add an extra layer of paint that still looks like it's over the top of the scratches. I still wanted to have a bit of a post-shading effect on the controls and also a little bit of grease and grime in some of the filler caps and inspection ports on the wings. To create this, I first get out some Tamiya black panel liner scent and run a bead of the black enamel wash onto the control surfaces and areas where I want to create a build-up, and once it's dry, I then use a fine brush to dab a bit of X20 thinners to remove the excess enamel. Because I use acrylic paints, this doesn't interfere with the camouflage pattern, meaning I can soften the effect as much as I want over time without causing any issues to the camouflage. I used some black Tamiya weathering powder to create a bit more of a burnt effect around the exhaust outlet, and also to add some dirt effects using both the mud and the sand colours on the wheels and also on the skids, seeing as they would get a little bit dirty since the aircraft were usually operating on grass strips. It was at this point that I realised I'd made the mistake of using wooden chipping on a metal panel, so to correct this, I painted over the wooden chipping effects with a layer of chocolate brown, and once this had dried, I then added some metal chipping. I then let the flat aluminium dry, and once it had, I added a final layer of chocolate brown over the top to help soften the metal chipping and add a bit more depth. And with that, the Airfix 1/72 scale Me163 was finally completed. And here you can see the final result. So I had a lot of fun building this kit and I'm quite happy with how it turned out. I probably could have spent a bit more time upgrading some of the details and maybe even doing a 3D printed cockpit, but I decided I just wanted to have a bit of fun with this kit and enjoy it for what it is, which is a pretty basic but still quite fun to build kit of the 163. The details are mostly raised, so they're not the best quality, and obviously the mold is from 1979, so there was a fair bit of cleanup required and the fit wasn't perfect, but all things considered, it's quite a fantastic little kit, and if you can get a hold of one, I would definitely recommend it. But thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and also subscribe to the channel to help things out. A big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying the supplies and the kits I use in my videos, and also a big thanks to my friend Andrew from the Queensland Air Museum for letting me have this kit to have a go at building. So, thanks again, and until the next video, as always, model on!